Greetings. So today we are looking at Congress, and this is our second week looking at Congress. And in particular today we're going to be evaluating their ability to make laws and their ability to control the executive in what's known as congressional oversight. So in this video we'll be looking at some examples of what they can do and also discussing how effective they are in fulfilling that role. But before we start, I want to just raise a question for you to think about, which is this. Should it be easy to make new laws? Now, I used this image, I think, in last week's video and last week's lessons, and the process of making a bill is incredibly complicated. You can see all of these different aspects here, all of these different bits that it has to go through, and this image is brilliant because it shows you all of the different places where a bill can fail. Every time there's a little red hand on a black little outline, as you can kind of see here, that's a place where a bill can potentially fail, and most bills fail. But is that good or is it bad? Now, in many ways, it's bad because it means that when you're trying to make a change to benefit the country, it means it's actually very unlikely to get through. But it also means that a country is protected from unwise legislation, from random kind of fads and random kind of changes. And I went to a lecture a few years ago with a guy who was lecturing about democracy, and he was arguing that democracy is at its best when it actually sets up a system that is designed to kind of keep the status quo unless there is an actual desperate need to change. That was his argument. I'm not saying I agree with the argument. But you could make an argument or an essay that either belittles Congress and says, look, most of these bills fail, it's a terrible system, it's not working, etc., etc. Easy case to make. Or you could go the other way and say, yes, this is a difficult system, but it's supposed to be deliberate. It is protecting Americans from unnecessary legislation, protecting their freedom, because they obviously have that big thing against tyranny. And it means there are lots of ways for representatives to protect their constituents from an overbearing and overzealous government, especially a federal government. So think about which way you might want to argue that in an essay. But let's have a little look now at some specifics of why so many bills actually fail. The first one is there are just so many bills. Now, in the UK system, most bills start from the government. So Boris Johnson gave a Queen's speech yesterday, and he's going to lay out the bills that he wants to put through Parliament, and there'll be a limited amount of them, and then they'll go to Parliament, and the process of Parliament will begin of committee work and first reading, second reading, and so on. But they start from the executive. In America, it's different. All bills actually initiate from the legislature itself. The president can suggest things, the president can ask them to do things, and the president can nominate a senator to kind of put a bill forward on his behalf, but they actually all start from the legislature, which means actually there's far more bills going into the American system. And if you looked at the textbook the other day, in our other lesson, you'll notice that there's literally hundreds, and in many cases thousands of bills that are being put through each year. So they fail because there's just so many of them that it would be impractical to get so many through. Secondly, as you saw from the previous slide, it's incredibly complicated. It has to go through various readings, it has to go through various committees, it has to get past the House Rules Committee, it has to, you've got the committee itself that will look at that individual bill, which might then be amended or changed or blocked. And then you've got to have the different votes, and you might get through one house but not the other house, and then you've got to have a committee that comes together to merge the two bills, even if it manages to get through, etc., etc., etc. It's complicated, and so for a bill to actually get through requires a lot of motivation, a lot of effort, a lot of petitioning people. It's not accidentally going to get through. It needs to be forced through by someone or a party or a president that really wants something to happen. The next reason why a bill might fail is that at various points it may well need a supermajority. Now, it doesn't have to get these, but if you think through the different parts of the legislative process, if there's a filibuster in the Senate, they need a significant majority to unblock that filibuster. If the legislature passes something, but the president vetoes it, they then need a supermajority to unblock back past the president. So another reason why a bill might fail is that it's not just 50% plus one that you need, like in the UK Parliament, but in many cases you may need a significant majority to actually get your bills through the legislature process. The next reason is the committees. Remember, committees don't necessarily have to look at legislation. They can block legislation, or they can attempt to. They can recommend that you block legislation using their committee stage, using their committee report, and the heads or the chairs of these committees, the individuals that actually head up each committee, have huge powers to block, to delay, to deny funding to certain kind of investigations, and so these committees themselves, which are only a small part of a particular house, can have huge amounts of power over particular bills, especially if they're not in favour of them. The next reason why a bill might fail is the US has a true bicameral system, a two-house system. Now, the UK has two houses, but we know that there's a significant difference in the power of those two houses. The Commons is well above the Lords in terms of the abilities that it has. And if the Commons really wants to get one through, then they can, after a delay or using the Parliament Act. So you could make an argument, I'm not sure I would, but you could make an argument in an essay that actually the UK is a unicameral system, and it only really has one legislative power, one legislative house, with a kind of revising chamber on the side. But the US, two even chambers where both have to approve any kind of legislature. So if you have a number of senators that want to block something, they can make things very difficult for you to get your legislation through. And the last reason we're going to look at here is this idea of divided government, which is something that's going to come up in this video quite a lot. This would be when perhaps you have a president who is a Democrat, but you have one or maybe both houses that are Republican. So Obama had this throughout the last few years of his presidency. He's a Democrat, but both houses were Republican. You can also get it when the houses themselves, one is Democrat, one is Republican, which is what we've got right now under President Trump in 2019. We've got a House of Representatives, which is just Democrat, and we've got a Senate, which is just Republican. Now, all of these things mean that the majorities will push different ways. So hopefully they can compromise, work together, get things through. But if they want to be difficult, divided government can make it even harder to get bills through. Perhaps maybe we should be surprised that any bills make it through. And when we look at that figure of 3%, remember 3% is the average amount of bills that actually make it through Congress, maybe we should be surprised that that's actually so high when you've got so many obstacles for bills to actually get through. But let's go to the counter argument here, because it's important to say that significant bills, important bills, do pass through Congress. There might not be many, but you could make a case in an essay that says, actually, although there are lots of obstacles in front of bills, that very important ones do make it through, especially when there's publicity, when there's a kind of a social motivation, etc., etc. A bit like constitutional amendments. You know, they did ban slavery, they did give women the vote. They can get things through in certain situations. So here's some examples of bills that have made it through. George Bush's No Child Left Behind, which was an educational initiative, got through in 2002. The Campaign Finance Reform Act also got through in 2002. Now, this is one we'll be coming back to later in the course, but there's a lot of controversy in America in regards to the funding of political parties and the funding of political candidates. This act and a subsequent one were designed to change the way that parties were funded, and it got through Congress. The Emergency Economic Stabilization Act 2008, not a particularly catchy title, but the big financial crash that affected the whole world from 2008 to 2009, think austerity in the UK, all of David Cameron's cuts, and when Gordon Brown had to try and really change what was going on in the world with finance, the crash of RBS. When this was going on in America, they did pass a bill which was designed to stabilize the economy at that time. The Affordable Care Act 2010, you know it as Obamacare. Very controversial one that. The Republicans really didn't want it, but it got through. And another example, a Disaster Relief Act in 2015, and the Iran Nuclear Agreement Act in 2015. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way you need to memorize all of these, but you do have significant examples that you can draw on there to make the point that significant and maybe even controversial bills can get through in the right circumstances, with the right president, with the right motivation in the country. So there's some good examples for you. But do keep in mind, despite the fact that these ones do get through, it's only ever 3% on average of bills that are started that get finished. Whichever way you want to argue in your essay is up to you, but you've definitely got the evidence on both sides. Let's talk about congressional oversight. We've got 2 slides here. Now, congressional oversight is the ability of the legislature to oversee the executive, to investigate them, to restrict them, to control them. Because in America, you have a clear separation of powers, and in separation of powers, every bit is supposed to be able to overrule every other bit. And we'll be looking at each one in turn, such as the judiciary and the executive and the legislature. And in many ways, this is an implied power, as in it doesn't specifically say in the Constitution the legislature is in charge of the executive. It doesn't say that. But it's implied by some of the things that are there, such as the nomination process and such as the ability to kind of create bills and so on, and even the impeachment power. It's implied, and so in many ways it's grown over time, and here are some examples. Now, Congress has standing committees, which we've talked about. They also have individual bill committees, and those committees can create investigations. They can even create new investigative committees called select committees in the USA to investigate certain aspects. And in those committees, they can summon members of the executive and other witnesses and other experts to either be chastised or investigated or to get their expertise. And if you think about it, in the UK, once a week you have PMQs, Prime Minister's Questions. Once a week, the Prime Minister has to go to the legislature and be thoroughly questioned. That doesn't happen to Donald Trump. In fact, it doesn't really happen anywhere else in the world, really. Well, okay, that's not quite true, but you certainly don't see it in America. And therefore, it is these committees that has this ability to summon individuals and question them. And here we've got Hillary Clinton, and she's been summoned by a committee here to talk about her role in a terrorist attack that happened in Benghazi. Now, of course, she wasn't involved in the terrorist attack. It was to do with how she responded to that attack because she was Secretary of State at the time. Of course, the standing committees as a whole are constantly investigating the executive, whether it's investigating an individual department like the standing committee that's in charge of energy, or whether they are interviewing individuals here. So you've got 2 people here you might recognize. You've got AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who's an up-and-coming Democrat, and you've also got President Trump's old lawyer, Cohen, I can't remember his first name off the top of my head now, but they summoned him and they asked him about his relationship with the president and certain illegal activities that he'd been involved with, and they investigated him. This was very, very famous. If you don't know this story, it's probably worth you having a look about it. But Congress summoned President Trump's lawyer and they questioned him intently about the crimes he had committed, and he implemented the president in a huge amount of things, which shows congressional oversight. Also, presidential nominations. You know this already. Every nomination, whether it's a judge or a member of a cabinet, has to go through the nomination procedure in the Senate. This is Betsy DeVos. She just scraped through as Minister of Education. By one vote, Mike Pence had to make the deciding vote, which is a story I think I've told you before. But they have the ability to oversee who goes into certain departments and who goes into the judiciary. Now, whether this power is used effectively, we'll come back to in a minute. And lastly, they can either block the president's legislation or create legislation to block the president. Let me give you 2 examples. First of all, Donald Trump wanted to repeal Obamacare, which in effect is creating a new law or removing a law that's already there. John McCain, who is the gentleman here, blocked Trump from doing that. It got to the Senate, it made it through the other house, I believe, and it got to the Senate, and Republicans had a majority in that house, so it should have got through, but John McCain, who is a Republican, blocked Donald Trump famously with a thumbs down motion. So they can block the president from doing certain things through legislation. They can also block the president by creating legislation themselves. So Donald Trump wanted to sell a lot of arms to Saudi Arabia. By arms, I mean weapons, bombs and guns and things. to make money for the US economy and also to look out for US interests in that region. Congress wasn't happy about it. They felt there was something dodgy going on. It wasn't something they wanted to be involved with. So they made a law that restricted the amount of arms that could actually be sold to Saudi Arabia. Now, in the end, Donald Trump vetoed their legislation, but this was an example where Congress was using their legislative powers to curb what the president could do. In fact, that's quite a good example for you to talk about the Saudi Arabia one, because it shows you the legislature trying to block the president, and it also shows you the president using his veto to block the legislature blocking him, which is definitely something you can play with in an essay. Again, these powers are stronger or weaker depending on whether the government is divided or not. Let's use this example here of the presidential nominations of Betsy DeVos. It just got through, but that in many ways was because there is a Republican majority in the Senate at that time. Think about the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh last year. Very controversial. There was accusations of things he'd done when he was younger, but in the end, everyone voted along party lines. The Senate voted along party lines. So all the Republicans basically said yes, I think maybe apart from one, and all the Democrats said no, I think again, maybe apart from one. So you could then ask the question, well, actually, is the Senate really doing what it's supposed to be doing? Is it actually overseeing the executive, or is it just voting along party lines? And that is a big difference, because you can't genuinely oversee something if you're either obeying the party whips or you're supporting a president or whatever it might be. The question is whether they can be effective if they are just going along those lines. And what we can see, if we look at these next ones, is that nominations only tend to be rejected by other parties, especially in recent years. And when George Bush was president, there were only ever 37 oversight committees in the entire time that he was president. He had a Republican majority for much of his time as president, and they barely investigated him at all. And when they did, it tended to be more of a, well done, keep going, type situation. So you could clearly make the example that the legislature is only effective in oversight when it is a different party to the president. Okay, make sure you understand the point I'm making there. It's only effective when it is a different party to the president. Another example to show this would be the example, the Hillary Clinton example here that we had with the Benghazi investigation. She was due to be a presidential candidate in 2016. She was, and they used their congressional oversight powers to investigate her for this Benghazi thing. Now, between you and me and YouTube, there wasn't really a lot to investigate. Every time they did one of these committees or investigation, they came back and said, she's fine, she's done nothing. But by repeatedly holding these investigations and by forcing her to testify under oath, it damages her. It kind of gives an implication of dodgy things going on. And lastly, here we could argue that the presidential popularity matters. When Obama was popular, then Congress was far more likely to acquiesce. When President Bush was popular over the Iraq War, and yes, believe it or not, when the Iraq War first happened, President Bush was very popular as a result. America had been attacked at 9/11, and there's a lot of national pride in America. So when America was attacked, they supported their president, and therefore Congress investigated the president far less. So whichever way you want to make your essay or your answer, I think you've got enough evidence on both sides here. Just make sure you've got the arguments that you would use, and also how you would counter the other arguments about whether Congress is being effective or not, or is Congress sometimes effective? You know, it depends on. That could be a higher level conclusion. Second slide, because there's a lot I want to talk about here. This is powers that Congress has, but are only sometimes used. This is why I've put actual powers in kind of question mark and so on. Whereas the other things should, in theory, be kind of taking place all the time. These ones are a bit more maybe, and maybe as and when. The first one is the executive is in charge of enforcing the law and providing a budget to various agencies, such as the FBI. But it is Congress that approves that annual budget. So let's say that the executive, including Trump, says, well, this is what we want to spend on this and this and this and this and this. And then it's down to Congress to say yes or no. Famously, Congress has shut down on Donald Trump now twice, and it was the longest shutdown ever. Shutdown is where the executive says, this is the budget for the year, and the legislature says, we aren't passing that. And it happened because Donald Trump put funding for his wall into the budget, and Congress said, we aren't passing funding for your wall. And they were shut down, I think, for over 30 days in the end. And that shut down various important services that people use. It meant that people weren't getting paid. It's worth you reading about that as a specific example and knowing about it, because it was it showed one of the limits of presidential powers. It's an important example, and it also shows one of the ways in which the legislature can try to control what the executive is doing by preventing a budget from being passed. They also ratify treaties. So president goes off, makes a deal with another country, or countries, is in the case of the UN or something like that, comes back to America, and then Congress has to ratify that treaty, i.e. they have to agree to it as well. Now, it's very rare for them not to ratify treaties. If you go and look back at what they've done, most of the time they acquiesce to it. So you could argue this one both ways. You could kind of say, well, technically they have the power to block any treaties, but the political reality is they barely have used that power to kind of block. And I think perhaps in a future video we should look at some specific examples of where they have and where they haven't. But this is a power you can certainly talk about that they have, but do they use it? This one goes even further along that same idea. Congress has the power to declare war. It's in the Constitution. It says Congress has the power to declare war. However, the last war they declared was World War II back in 1941. America joined later than the other countries. And so that means Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, even the Cold War, for example, although you could argue that's not a real war, Korea. The Congress has never declared any of those wars. It's technically a power, but the political reality is they seem to have lost it. It seems to have moved to the executive. Now, there could be good reasons for that. In fact, no, let's rephrase. There are good reasons for that. The executive can move faster, can move quicker, and perhaps you want to be quite secretive maybe in the ways when you start military action. You don't want to be like, hey, everybody, look what my Congress is voting on so they can see what I'm doing. There are good reasons why you'd want it to be a swift, decisive decision made by the executive amongst a few key individuals rather than a mass. Not denying that. However, Congress could well be, you could argue here that Congress has lost the ability to oversee America's foreign affairs. Now, we need to look at this in more detail, especially in regards to the impact that Nixon had, and we'll do that when we get to looking at the president, but there's definitely an issue here. And lastly, there's the nuclear button. No, not the ability to declare war, but the ability to actually impeach a president or judges and things like that. No president has ever been successfully impeached. There have been 2 inquiries, Bill Clinton and Andrew Jackson, double check that second one. Both of them were acquitted by the Senate. Nixon resigned before his impeachment requirement went anywhere. Of course, the investigation into Donald Trump is ongoing right now. Did it succeed? I guess you'll probably know before you get to your exams, but you can make a case both ways. You can say, well, Congress has this power, therefore it's effective, and it's important, and that it's always there in case they need to remove a president. Or you could say, actually, this power has never been successful, and therefore it's not strong enough. And again, divided government. If either house is on the same side of the president, then there's no chance of it happening, especially as it needs to be a supermajority. You can make the case either way, but technically it's there as a power. So to summarize then with this slide, to what extent are these powers actually used? They have these powers. Are they actually used regularly? And to what extent are they actually effective even when they are used? Hopefully you can work your way through those ones and discuss the effectiveness of them. So where would you use all this kind of stuff in an exam question? Here's 3 that are in some of the textbooks that you could kind of talk about. Evaluate the extent to which Congress is able to check the executive branch effectively. So effectively, this PowerPoint slide, you'd need to pick a side and go through examples, make your case, making sure that you did balance views on both sides. Evaluate the extent to which Congress is an effective legislative body. You'd need to use some of the information from last week's video as well as this one to debate that one. And a more general question here. Evaluate the extent to which Congress can be fairly considered to be the broken branch. Now that is, you'd have to then compare that to perhaps the judiciary, compare that to the executive, but to what extent is Congress the messed up branch? You could go through the various systems and you could talk about powers they don't have and talk about the House Rules Committee and all sorts, but I think that would actually be quite an interesting essay to write. However, I wouldn't write that one until you've studied the presidency and the judiciary. Cool. Hope you found that helpful. Make sure you take some notes, ask me any questions. If I've got anything wrong, let me know in the comment section, and I'll see you in class.